Hello, and welcome to the Fall 2021 seminar series of the Living Earth Collaborative and Washington University's Evolution, Ecology, and Population Biology group. My name is Sasha Heath, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative, and I will be hosting our speaker today. Because this is the first seminar of our fall series, I'll go over some logistics of how we run the seminar. I will first introduce the speaker, who will give about a 40 to 50-minute talk. Feel free to post your questions in the YouTube chat to the right of the video during the talk or after. After the talk, I, along with Mike Moore, who is today's tech guru, will read the chat questions to the speaker, who will then have the opportunity to respond to your questions and chat more about their work. So please keep the questions coming in the chat. And after question and answer, we'll end the seminar at 5 o'clock. I also want to mention that we are now scheduling one-on-one Zoom meetings with speakers the days of their talks. Next week, we will hear from Dr. Caleb Axelrod. If you would like to meet with Dr. Axelrod or any future speakers, please look out for the scheduling link in the emailed seminar announcements. The entire fall schedule is posted to the Living Earth Collaborative website and are listed on this YouTube channel. And now on to today's speaker. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Andrew Kaul, who will be speaking today about his dissertation research in tallgrass prairies. Dr. Kaul is currently a postdoctoral research in restoration ecology with the Missouri Botanical Garden here in St. Louis. Since starting at the garden, Dr. Kaul has started up several research projects on the community and restoration ecology of the herbaceous community in oak woodland and glade habitats of the Ozarks. Andrew received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Iowa State University and previously attended St. Olaf College for his BA, where he majored in biology with a concentration in environmental studies. In addition to research, Andrew is clearly a great teacher, as he was awarded the Teaching Excellence Award as a graduate student at Iowa State. And his growing list of publications demonstrate not only his work on the plant ecology and restoration of tallgrass prairie, but also his interest in research in pollination and pollinators in these systems. So without further ado, let's learn more about these prairie systems by welcoming Dr. Andrew Kaul. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about a handful of projects I did as part of my dissertation work, as Sasha said, at Iowa State. Thank you for that introduction. I've been at the Missouri Botanical Garden for about a year now, so I would love to be telling you all about the suite of new projects I've started in the past year, but they're all at this place where I'm not quite ready to be sharing results. So I'm going to talk about a couple of completed projects, and then a project that is sort of right in the middle of getting worked on, and then one brand new project I've started on prairie research since starting at the Botanic Garden. So I have some other interests, but today we're going to focus all in on this question of how do we restore prairies and what's going on with Prairie Restorations, which is something I'm really excited to talk to you about. And I hope I can convince you that this is something interesting to think about. So I wanted to mention that I'm funded on a grant from the Bellwether Foundation. So the work I'm talking about today is both stuff that I did at Iowa State, and then again, some new projects that I've started here at MoBot. And before going into all the research, I wanted to get the acknowledgements done. At Iowa State, a lot of my research was funded by a grant from the Iowa Department of Transportation, which is really cool. There's a lot of resources in Iowa for natural resources work with roadsides and rights of way, which is a cool opportunity. So they funded a lot of my research. I got a grant from Prairie Biotic, and I did a lot of collaborations with people in Iowa at the DNR. And I wanted to thank a whole suite of undergrads who worked on a variety of these projects. And then since starting here at MoBot, of course, I want to acknowledge my lab, the Albrecht lab, and a handful of folks that I've been collaborating with at Shaw Nature Reserve. So these are all, group projects. So I've got 5 major parts of the talk today. I'm going to start out with why I care so much about prairie restoration, why I think it's a really cool little world to work in, both as an applied ecologist and as someone interested in general ideas about how communities are arranged. And then we're going to talk about the biggest project as part of my dissertation, where I went and looked at just a ton of prairie restorations to try to learn a little bit about general patterns among lots of sites. And then we're going to talk a little bit about milkweeds, have this little vignette about this specific wildflower assemblage, because a lot of people care about milkweeds these days. So we'll see why they care about milkweeds and what we learned about them. And then that fourth project is one that I'm currently working on, looking at functional traits. And we'll end with the new project here at MoBot, where we're thinking about new ways of managing existing restorations, sort of combining existing management techniques. Okay, so Prairie Restoration is a model system. So I think this is a really interesting world to work in because it's both basic and applied. If you think about being a plant community ecologist or just a community ecologist in general, if you want to understand how communities work, you want to create them from scratch. So you might design a group of species and throw some seeds out into bare ground and see how they grow and learn something about how communities assemble from that kind of experiment. But as an applied ecologist doing restoration of grasslands, it's the exact same methodology. So I think this is a particularly fruitful world to do research in because the relationship between basic and applied grassland ecologists has been like really, really fruitful over the past couple decades. So I think that's a real strength of this world. I like grasslands, I think, because they're like easier systems to work in. If you are interested in forest, that's super cool, but it takes, decades or centuries for some of your organisms to grow and reproduce. Whereas grasslands are great because the plants are like small enough you can see the whole thing, and they reproduce at like the time scales where you can actually monitor them. So I think that's a real advantage. And then I think tallgrass prairie, which is our native grassland in this part of the world in Missouri, is a great system to study because there's this real conservation need. There's a lot of demand for information on how to actually preserve existing prairies and recreate new ones. And then within these areas, I focus on plant species diversity because it's sort of the first step. A lot of people are really interested in animal habitat or pollinators or other ecosystem services, but there's this idea that unless we get the plants there, that's sort of our first step, and we got to figure that out before everything else is going to kind of come together to create the whole ecosystem, which of course is more than just plants. So that's kind of the world that I work in. And a quick word about language. In the world of restoration, sometimes in grasslands, we use the word reconstruction to refer to starting a new prairie community from scratch, and restoration as a word to talk about managing existing grasslands that haven't been plowed. But today, I'm just going to say restoration in reference to de novo prairie plantings. I hope you can forgive me for that. So this is sort of the question in restoration ecology. Really fascinating. We start with bare ground, just some black dirt in the middle of the Midwest, and we want to create a beautiful, stable, diverse, functioning ecosystem. And it's a really great test of how well we understand the processes that are important in building communities. If we understand everything that's important about plant community assembly in these grasslands, we should be able to do it. And it's remarkable how bad we are at it usually. Restoring prairies isn't easy. It's not straightforward. And very few prairie restorations actually reach the level of plant diversity that we see in our reference communities, which are the high quality, intact, extant prairie remnants. So yeah, how do we bridge this gap? How do we get better at restoring prairies? And in what ways do our sort of best efforts to date sort of fall short? So the tallgrass prairie system I work in, this is the best map of it that's out there. There's a lot of different maps. But what's important here is that it's a really large system, covers most of the middle third of the continent. This is the wettest part of the Great Plains, which extend all the way west to the foothills of the Rockies. So if we think globally about grasslands, tallgrass prairie is cool because it really is one of the highest diversity areas. If you look down at a small plot of land, you'll see way more species here than in most grasslands anywhere else. And the other important features of it are that the species in grasslands are mostly wildflowers. They're called grasslands because the dominant species are grasses, but the vast majority of the species diversity here are forbs or wildflowers, and they're long-lived species. They can live for several years to decades. When I worked with the Echinacea project, they were estimating that some of their focal individuals they've been doing demography on were like 60 years old or something like that. So it has interesting implications for restoring a system when once you get a plant there, it lives really a long time. So now, of course, throughout the historic tallgrass prairie range, most of that land has been converted to urban, suburban, or agricultural land uses. So unlike some of the mixed and shortgrass prairie to the west, we really have lost almost all of the tallgrass prairies. And so a lot of people are really interested in conserving what we do have left and then trying to recreate new ones. So this is a prairie restoration. They all look pretty different, but this I think has some important features that are common, which is that it's dominated by grasses, and there are some native wildflower species, but it's not super diverse. And if you see that nice kind of hazy patch of purple in the background, that's all Canada thistle, which is an exotic species and not exactly what we're looking for. So why is this what our restorations look like, and how can we do better? So the restoration process is in some ways very complicated, but in other ways it's pretty straightforward because there aren't that many things you have to worry about when you're doing a prairie restoration. You pick your site. You can do soil amendments. I'm not going to talk about that today, but sometimes people change aspects of the soil biology. But then you create your seed mix, the composition. You have to choose how many species you want in your seed mix, the relative abundances of those species, and then you have to choose when you're going to put it out there, if you're going to seed multiple times. And then once you have vegetation, you have to manage it in some kind of way. Because in the tallgrass prairie region, where it's quite warm and wet, trees grow very well. If you don't manage a grassland, pretty soon you've got a forest. So management tends to be disturbances. And there's all kinds of research on the right way to disturb a prairie. What kinds of disturbances, how frequent, how intense, the right combination of grazing and burning and mowing. And figuring that out has been a long process over many years, figuring out the right way to establish species and not favor certain ones over others. So as a quick caveat, I wanted to mention that bison are a keystone species historically in tallgrass prairie systems, but they're really restricted to a couple of locations and they're just not common on the landscape anymore. So there's a lot of prairie biology happening, a lot of prairie area being conserved and restored, and it's almost all happening in the context of no bison. So that's sort of an interesting context to be doing grassland biology without this sort of like important aspect of historic grassland systems. But that's where we're at. We have to understand how to recreate and manage them, even though we don't have these bison grazers. Okay, so now we're into it. We're going to talk about what drives diversity across lots of prairie restorations. So with this chapter, which is sort of my biggest chapter of my dissertation, we wanted to answer some really general questions like, how are prairie restorations being managed? Like what's the common way people are doing things? How diverse are they? How invaded? What's the variation in how invaded they are? How grassy are they? The ratio of grasses to forbs is something that we know is important. And you can look at a single site and get some information, but it's useful to know across all of these prairie restorations, of which now there are thousands across the whole Midwest, what's kind of going on. And then among all the different features of a prairie restoration, things that could go right or could go wrong, of all the things that could matter, what are the most important variables? The things you should really pay attention to if you want it to go right. And then of course, we're gonna talk about those milkweeds after we're done with some of the more general patterns. So this is a nice cartoon from a publication of my graduate advisor, Brian Wilsey. And so the idea here is we have prairie remnants represented by these blue lines, and they have a lot of diversity. Right? That's our y-axis is species diversity. And over time, there's some variation, but they're nice and high. And then we have these two different trajectories for how a restoration can go. At year 0, you've got no species yet, but you put in some nice seeds and you're hoping they're all gonna recruit. And so what's useful about this figure is we needed to test the relationship between age of your prairie restoration and how many species you see in it. Because historically, there was this idea in the literature that over time, prairies would become more and more diverse, and we didn't really need to worry about them. Species would disperse in from other areas, or if you didn't see all the species that you established from your seed mix right away, they'd come in over time and it would kind of get better. And unfortunately, everyone who's paid attention to what happens as prairies tend to age is what we see is this pattern that looks more like this red line, where after maybe 3 to 5 years, you see kind of a peak in species diversity. And then things start to go kind of wrong and we start to lose some of those species that we initially got established And that can kind of plateau, or it can actually get pretty bad. And we just wanted to see across lots of different sites if there's a general pattern about age and diversity. So that was one of our major questions. So this is my most complicated slide. So if you can make it through this one, you'll be okay the rest of the presentation. So here I'm just outlining all of the different variables that we wanted to examine in looking at general patterns in prairie restorations. So on the right here, we can see age. We think that might matter. And there's a couple different predictions about that. We also think that exotic species, their presence and abundance could be really important in terms of determining the species diversity and richness, as well as the mix establishment. So that's a response variable that, that measures how similar the plant community in our sampled restoration matches the seed mix that was used at that site. So that's a Bray-Curtis similarity measure. And exotic species have been shown, at least in tallgrass prairie areas, to have really different traits, different reproductive biology, different phenology than native species. So we have reason to think that when those are there, things might be going differently. And then, of course, some recent studies have shown that climate during establishment really matters, or rather weather during the first year or two. There are these really strong year effects where if it's wetter or drier or hotter or cooler, especially when those seeds are first germinating and recruiting, you can get really different outcomes as opposed to different years. So that can certainly matter. Previous land use could be categorized a lot of different ways, but obviously the legacy of how the land was used before we turned it into a prairie can matter. In our study, we classified all the sites in only a couple of land use classes, and basically it's whether the land was agricultural or not. And then there are site characteristics that might matter. If you pull from basic like island biogeography, you could think like larger areas might hold more species. And then fractal dimension is a measure of linearity. So the shape of the prairie restoration might have something to do with how many species we find there. The soil, if it's more or less fertile, could certainly determine how many species we find. And then all the things we can actually control, like your seed mix, how the seed was sown, and then burning and mowing treatments. So there's all kinds of things that we have good reason to think could be important, and we wanted to figure out which ones of these were the most important predictors. Our other major question with this data set was a prediction about the spatial heterogeneity of the plant species that we see. So beta diversity, this is within sites, not between sites. But within a given restored prairie, we thought that in areas that didn't have a lot of exotic species, that we're calling uninvaded, that over time you would see species sorting and you would get greater beta diversity. So in a brand new prairie restoration, you just put the seed mix everywhere. So all the species are all everywhere, right? There's not a lot of spatial structure. But over time, you might see sorting of different species doing better in upland or lowland areas, wetter or drier areas. Whereas if we look at a prairie restoration that's become heavily invaded by exotic species, we think that this beta diversity would decrease and you get sort of a homogenization effect. So we wanted to test that too. Yeah. Okay, so what did we do? We drove all over the state of Iowa and sampled as many prairies as we could over 2 summers. Everything was sampled during July, just so we could sort of compare across sites. But the goal was just to hit as many sites as we possibly could, so we would have a lot of power to test some of these predictions. A really important part of this study design was that we did not contact landowners or managers and ask where sites were, because if you talk to a land manager and say, hey, I want to look at some prairies, they're going to show you their best ones. And we really wanted a random sampling of what these areas can look like. So we got information on where every prairie planting was in the state, and then randomly selected those locations, went and sampled the vegetation, and then afterwards called up managers and said, hey, we sampled this area. Can you tell me about when it was sown, what was sown there, how it was managed? And so that was really exciting because everything was really random, and some of the sites were really good and some of them were terrible. And that's really exciting because it gives us the variation that you need to actually build a model to describe what's happening here. And it's funny because for some locations, we had access to really, really detailed records about how the land had been managed. And for some areas, nobody ever bothered to write down anything about those sites. Or like one person, I called them and they said, oh yeah, we used to have really good records, but they were kept in a shed that burned down 3 years ago, So you kind of got to deal with what you've got. So here they are. Half of our prairie restorations in this data set, we called conservation prairies. And these are mostly areas that were managed by the Iowa DNR, but also some county and private groups. And then the other half were roadside prairie plantings. This project was funded by the DOT. And in Iowa, there's a lot of rights of way or area that's managed by the DOT that is planted like with diverse prairie mixes. And they wanted to know what was going well and what wasn't going well with those areas. And then we sampled 5 prairie remnants to get sort of a baseline for what our restorations could look like if they really achieved that high level of diversity. So our total numbers was 93 restorations and 5 remnants. So in addition to sampling vegetation, we also collected 3 soil cores at each site. It was only down to 10 centimeters, but we just wanted to sort of coarsely characterize differences in soil characteristics. So we analyzed soil for pH, organic matter, and bulk density. So this is what we found. Sites looked really, really different. On the left here, this is sort of a weird site. It's super grassy. All those white flowers are a European carrot. It's not a native species. And on the right, this is pretty nice. It's pretty diverse. It's a nice mixture of grasses and forbs. That's at a state park in Iowa. So I'll spare you all the tables from the different analyses. But what we found overall was that the abundance of exotic species at a given site was by far the best predictor of species richness, diversity, and establishment from the seed mix. And I'll show you a figure explaining that pattern in a second. The other thing that was important was a mowing treatment. So managers have developed this very specific way of using mowing to facilitate recruitment of species from the seed mix. And people haven't really tested whether it works experimentally, but it's pretty common practice. And we actually found that it was a really important predictor in our model. And the other interesting one was precipitation really mattered. So prairie restorations that were planted in years that happened to have more precipitation the first year or two after sowing had higher establishment. There was greater similarity between the seed mix and the resulting community, which sort of makes sense. If you have water, these young seedlings that are sensitive to drought or competition tended to do a little bit better on average. So that's a strong evidence for a year effect. So the pattern with exotic species we found was this. On our x-axis, we have proportion of the biomass from non-native species. And so it runs the full spectrum. We have lots of sites that have like no exotic species. They're not invaded at all. And some sites where basically you approach 100% exotic biomass and all throughout that range. And so what we see is there's some variability. At low levels of invasion, you have some sites that are really diverse and some sites that are really not diverse. However, as you move towards higher degrees of invasion, what never happens once you have 60, 70, 80, 90% exotic biomass is you never get a ton of different exotic species coexisting together. You don't see communities of like 30 or 40 exotic species all coexisting nicely. You tend to get this increasingly less diverse system where you have a monoculture of something like smooth brome or reed canary grass. And so that's not what we're looking for. And that trend was really clear for both diversity and just overall richness. So here's that mowing treatment. So what the managers do is the year after you add seeds, they mow down, not like to bare ground, but they would use like a high mower on a tractor to just cut vegetation down to around like 6 inches or 8 inches the first year. And the second year, they would use it to cut it down to about a foot. And the idea is when you mow down existing vegetation, it like all the things that come in on their own before the seed mix can recruit, it increases light to the ground and increases the ability for those sown species to establish. So the effect on diversity wasn't super strong, but we see this, a few species consistent increase in species richness with that extra mowing treatment compared to sites where they didn't use any mowing post treatment, or this other treatment, which would be a whole hodgepodge of other things where they would hay instead of mowing, or some managers would like mow every year, or would not mow right after sowing, but would mow just in year 7 or something like that. So compared to any other treatments, this only establishment mowing seems to be, on average, really helping to recruit a few more species from the seed mix. And this is why. So this is a picture of a prairie the first year after it was sown. This was a field that was previously in a corn and soy rotation. And so if you just kind of squint your eyes at this field, you might think, oh, that looks not so bad as a prairie. But only one or two of these species are actually sown species. This is what happens. The year after you seed, all of those long-lived prairie species are just short little seedlings. But what you see here is a bunch of exotic annuals and weeds. And so this is the kind of vegetation you would mow heavily that first year and kind of suppress it while you're giving those native prairie species that are a little slower growing a chance to get a little bit bigger. So when we look at all of our sites, what are the general patterns? So compared to our 5 remnants that we use as a reference, our restorations tend to be about half as species rich, about 40% is diverse. And then this range is huge, all the way from basically 0 to 1. In terms of invasion, our prairie restorations are about about twice as invaded as remnants. And they're also a lot grassier, right? So they're 130% as grassy as remnants. And so what we see when we look at grass forb ratios in remnants, it's about half and half. And I'll talk about that more later. But one of the issues we see with restorations is they tend to have a lot more grasses in them. So we had some predictions going into this project that exotic species would be problematic, having done prairie restoration biology for a while. And so we've developed some predictions that some of our variables might affect diversity or richness indirectly through how they affect invasion rates. So we used some structural equation models to test these predictions. And what we saw was that sites with higher organic matter and sites that were more linear, so potentially having more edge effects, had higher rates of invasion, and thus indirectly decreased diversity, because there was this really strong negative relationship between degree of invasion and diversity. And interestingly, age did not have any significant consistent relationship with diversity at all. There are sites that are very old and are very high diversity or very low diversity, and same thing with middle-aged and young prairies. There are things that are really important, but age just isn't a consistent predictor of how many species you're going to find. And the story is the same for species richness. So what about the seed mix, right? All you have to do is put out a lot of seeds and you'll get a lot of species and you'll have a diverse prairie. It's not that simple. We actually didn't see a significant direct relationship between sown richness or sown diversity and sampled richness, which is interesting. There are other things that are more important as opposed to just putting a lot of species in your seed mix. What we did find was this indirect effect where on average, when you put more species into your seed mix, we had lower rates of invasion. And so indirectly, we ended up with more species there. But that pathway was significant only through how it modulated invasion rates. So what about this prediction about beta diversity? Do we get differences in that sort of spatial heterogeneity of the plant community in areas that are more or less invaded? So we tested this by using 50% as our cutoff. So any prairie restoration that was over 50% exotic biomass, we called invaded, and under 50% we called uninvaded. And so we tested this prediction, the ANCOVA, and we did not find support for our predictions, actually. We kind of thought we would see an X, and instead what we see is that beta diversity in general, that spatial variation in community composition, is much lower in invaded sites. So exotic species did tend to homogenize the community, but that effect seems to be there right away and doesn't really change with site age. The uninvaded sites tended to have somewhat higher beta diversity, but that didn't really relate to prairie age either. So I wanted to highlight some nice pictures here, just showing you guys that the story isn't so grim. There are some prairie restorations that look really awesome. There were some conservation areas that had lots of species, and the community looked really nice. And this is a really high diversity roadside planting. So it wasn't like all of one of these two site types was really great or really bad. There's all kinds of variation in both of them. So we come back to our general diagram here. This is sort of the conclusion was that the best predictor by far was invasion. You just can't have a diverse prairie if you have a lot of exotic species there. Age wasn't a good predictor. If you can predict the future and figure out when it's going to rain a lot in the spring, you should plant that year because precipitation really helps recruitment from seed mixes. And then there are some features of prairies that can affect the recruitment as modulated by exotics. And this is pretty consistent with people who spent a lot of time in grasslands. The best prairies are on the worst soils. The worse the soil, the better the plant community. And then this mowing treatment, no one had really shown that this was important before, so it was exciting to see that this comes out as being a useful predictor of how to do better prairie restoration. So yeah, this paper came out just this past year. If you want to read more, it's sort of a long story. There's a lot of different aspects to this study, but you can go check that out. So yes, we're on to the next project. While we were out there sampling all these prairies, we thought we might as well also look at what's happening with milkweeds. There's this big group at Iowa State, the Iowa Monarch Consortium, working on all kinds of aspects of monarch biology. And they funded me, gave me some money for an RA so I could look at what was happening with milkweeds because we're really interested in establishing more of them on the landscape. So the story with milkweeds, for anyone who isn't listening or who doesn't know about this story yet, is that monarch butterflies throughout the central US have an annual migration route. They live in northern Midwest throughout the summer, and over the winter they fly south to Mexico, and the next year they come back up. So it's this fantastically interesting multi-generational migration, but the monarch butterfly population has been declining over the past couple of decades. There's a lot of concern about that population potentially going extinct. And there's a lot of debate about why the monarch population is doing what it's doing. But one of the major mechanisms that's been proposed is loss of milkweeds because monarch butterfly caterpillars can only grow on milkweeds. It's an obligate host plant. And there used to be a lot of milkweeds throughout all of the US, even in agricultural fields. However, since the inception of glyphosate-resistant crops, we've really lost a lot of milkweeds in the landscape. And so some people feel that the loss of all these milkweeds, these host plants, is one of the major mechanisms for why we lost monarch butterflies. So if you look at the milkweed literature, which is a very specific niche, it's quite amusing because there's all these papers in the past about how to get rid of them. They're an agricultural pest weed. How do we get rid of this agricultural weed? And then recently, all of a sudden, it's like, how do we get more milkweeds in the landscape? How do we save milkweeds? So we thought we would learn a little bit about what we could in terms of where milkweeds are in prairies, what kinds of species are around, and see if there's anything we could learn about what kinds of prairie habitats tend to be better sites for milkweeds. So we thought we would test among our conservation prairies, our roadside prairies, and our remnants, whether milkweed stem densities differed, and then what site level factors predicted milkweed abundance. And the prediction here is pretty straightforward. Milkweeds are ruderal plants, they're weedy. So we thought we would find them in higher abundances in places where you'd find more weeds, where they're more linear, where soil fertility was higher, there was more disturbance, and perhaps younger prairie restorations because they would have been disturbed more recently. So this is the same data set. When we were at all of these 98 prairies, we just counted the number of milkweed stems within a meter of all of our quadrats. So this came out in 2020, and what we found was remnant prairies are really great habitats for milkweeds, like a lot of native wildflower species. Stem densities were way higher in prairie remnants compared to restored prairies in general. However, the composition of the milkweed assemblage is a little different in remnant and restored prairies. So Asclepias syriaca is common milkweed, and as you see, common milkweed abundance is really low across remnants. So it's different species that we see in those communities compared to our restored prairies. And then we see that there's a lot more total milkweeds and common milkweeds in roadsides compared to conservation areas. And in general, these big conservation prairies don't have very many milkweed stems. So again, this is our common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. And what's interesting about this one is it's almost never planted anywhere, and it's pretty common everywhere. So like in all the prairie restorations that we sampled where we found it, it wasn't sown. This is a volunteer. And so it's kind of exciting that it comes in on its own. And then this swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed are planted very frequently and only kind of sort of come in occasionally. So they don't come in as readily as you might expect. And then there are some more conservative rare species like this prairie milkweed, or like Asclepias amplexicalis or Asclepias rotella, these rarer milkweeds that you really only see in prairie remnants. They're not being added in prairie seed mixes, and you don't see them like in roadsides. And then here's our nice little caterpillar from our monarch butterfly. So where are milkweeds more abundant? We found two patterns here. There's a lot more total milkweed density and common milkweed stem density in sites with higher pH, which hadn't been documented before. So there might be something to do with germination or seedling recruitment. And then, as we expected, we also see higher milkweed densities in sites with lower soil bulk density. So this is like more disturbed habitats, looser soils, which is consistent with them being sort of a disturbance-prone species. So here we see common milkweed just growing super happily in a roadside full of European smooth brome. It's nice to see that they grow pretty well even in tough habitats. They can compete and hold on. And one of our big conclusions here was that roadsides are a really good target location for milkweed restoration. Here's another common milkweed hanging out in this weird roadside planting with a bunch of big blue stem and goldenrods. So they do well on roadsides. So yeah, some follow-up studies with that pH discovery that they did better in higher pH sites. Potentially that could be because the fertilizer that's added to agricultural fields in this landscape context could be decreasing pH. And so it's possible that milkweeds are responding to fertilizer. And also we can alter soil pH pretty easily with lime. And so I think this deserves some follow-up work to see if we can amend soil in a way that helps us get more milkweeds in the landscape. So if you want to read more about milkweeds and prairies, there's that one. Okay, so those are some completed projects. On to some current and ongoing prairie restoration questions. So a lot of times we compare prairie restorations of varying ages and qualities to existing remnant communities just to see if they're different, and they always are in every way we've ever really kind of asked. But we sometimes forget this middle step of seed mixes. So I'm really curious about how these two filters, these two processes that select on species interact to produce the communities that we see in restored prairies. So this filter here, this red arrow, is the anthropogenic filter, where people, seed producers, seed vendors, and managers who design seed mixes are picking species, assuredly not at random from the species pool. And so I think it's possible that our prairie restorations look different than our remnants because of the species we're putting into the seed mix. But then additionally, certainly some of the seeds that we put out in the landscape with our seed mixes don't recruit. And that's our biotic filter. And those two things kind of are going to interact. I think understanding independently and synergistically what these look like will help us to understand how to bridge the gap between these different prairie types. So right now we're interrogating patterns in trait space using this existing data set where we have relative abundances of species in 5 remnants, 48 seed mixes, and 93 restorations. But we may be able to add other data sets, other people who've sampled remnants, so we can sort of amp these up. But right now, for some preliminary analyses, this is what we're using. So the traits that I have available at this point for all the species that we saw in any seed mix, any remnant, or any prairie restoration, we needed to get leaf traits and plant height. So we've got information on specific leaf area and leaf dry matter content, which relate to different resource strategies for exploitative plant growth versus conservative plants, ones that grow faster or grow slower and a little more competitive. In the future, we might be able to add to this trait data set by getting seed mass information from the TRI database. We know seed mass is really important in a lot of studies like this. And we have these leaves from all kinds of species, and we had intended to analyze them, but our CDAN analyzer broke, and then I graduated and we had a pandemic. So I have leaves just sitting waiting to be analyzed for leaf nitrogen, but we will have that data as well. So the plan for this project is to use a community-weighted trait values approach. So you just take the average trait value for your species and multiply it by the abundance of that species in your community, and then we can compare how these communities look. So there is some similar work here. Zerbel et al. Looked at height, pollination syndrome, seed mass, and specific leaf area in 170 species, but they were interested in how traits mapped onto ecosystem function, which is a little different than this sort of comparison. And I wanted to mention a really cool paper that came out recently. Ladwig et al. 2020 did this comparison right here. They looked at savannas in Wisconsin, and they took data sets on the species found in remnant savannas and modern savanna seed mixes. And they did a trait-based comparison of those two and found that the actual species overlap was very small, but the trait overlap was identical. So similar species, but different species were showing up in the seed mixes. So I think that's pretty cool. And this is sort of a novel approach to looking at how traits can inform restoration biology. So in order to build this data set, I drove around all over the state in 2018 and just collected leaves and measured the height of all kinds of different species, because we had to have not only the really rare species and the remnants, the common ones in the restorations, we also had to have data on the exotic species that showed up in all of our sites, because they're part of that community functional trait space. So what are our predictions about what we're going to find with these three basic variables? So specific leaf area, which is a measure of how much mass there is per area of leaf surface. We have two different predictions, because a big part of prairie community composition is the ratio of the grasses to the forbs, and there are general trends in leaf dry matter content and SLA where wildflowers or forbs have lower leaf dry matter content and higher SLA compared to grasses. So if we look at the whole community, because these seed mixes tend to be really grassy, the prediction is that for the whole community, SLA is going to be lower in seed mixes compared to your remnant community. But if you just look at forbs, I think you're going to see actually that the seed mixes are selecting for forbs that are a little bit more, maybe you'd say like ruderal. We have the opposite prediction for leaf dry matter content. And then for plant height, I think that when people are building seed mixes, they want prairies that look nice. And so I think people tend to choose plants that are taller. This is sort of a showiness prediction. And then once you have your seed mix, we can make predictions about the kinds of species that are actually going to recruit better into your restoration. And I think additionally, we're going to get species that are taller just because there's so much competition for light early on, and the taller species are going to have that advantage. So we have one preliminary analysis I can show you today using just these three traits. We ran a PCA, and we see that basically with these three traits, we've got two variables. So on our y-axis, we have height. So the dots here are whole communities. So this is a community with on average lower height, so shorter species and taller species. And then this x-axis basically loads where we've got species that have higher leaf dry matter content and lower SLA over here, and higher SLA and lower LDMC over here. And so what's interesting about this result is well, that we see differences between our mixes and our remnants and our restorations, but they're in different directions. So if our remnants are a reference community, and this is the trait space that those species occupy, our mixes are a little different in terms of having higher leaf dry matter content and lower SLA, but then our restorations deviate from our remnants in the other direction. So that's kind of interesting. So future work is going to involve teasing apart how these trends are determined by different functional groups and how much the presence of exotic species in restorations are changing things. Because it's possible that the native species in restorations have more similar trait space to the remnants. So that's ongoing. So my final story for you today is a new project that just got on the ground a couple of weeks ago. And this is new work that I started at the Missouri Botanic Garden because I'm working out at Shaw Nature Reserve a lot. And through talking with the managers, we wanted to come up with a project that would be useful for managing existing prairies. There's a lot of research on what we can do at the outset of prairie restoration, but it's less clear what we can do once you have a failed restoration. It's a bit of a harsh word, but I wanted to catch your attention. So here is a figure I showed you earlier from the Prairie Retrospective data set, where we have this degree of invasion on the x-axis and our diversity on the y. And over here, we know when we get a ton of invasion, we don't have very diverse areas. But there's some interesting variation on this end of the spectrum, where we have sites that are not very invaded, and some of them are extremely diverse, like a remnant would be. This is our remnant reference line. And some of them are super not diverse, right? So this is a prairie that's almost 0% invaded, and it has a diversity basically of 1. And so what does that prairie look like? Well, it's basically a monoculture of big bluestem. It's a C4 grass dominated area. So this leads us to the question, can a grassland be too grassy? And I think the answer is yes. So there's a lot of research on grass-forb ratios in prairies. And I'll just kind of summarize this literature for you here real quickly. So restored prairies over time tend to become more dominated by these warm season grasses. And in general, they tend to have a higher grass to forb ratio than these reference remnant communities. And the result of that higher C4 grass dominance is that you lose diversity in subdominant species, especially forb species. So I wanted to pull out this quote from an earlier paper from some work done in Illinois, where they said at this Fermilab site, which is one of the first sites where they had multiple prairie restorations, Andropogon gerardii, or big bluestem, increased in frequency in some areas to the almost complete exclusion of other species. So what do we do about this problem when our grasslands are too grassy? This is a nice prairie remnant, just for reference. This is what they can look like. They're kind of short, and there's lots of individuals, and the ratio is a lot more equal, 50 to 50. So here are some prairie restorations. This is one on the left that I think is kind of fun. We planted a new prairie restoration without the big 3 C4 grasses. So that's big bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. We were curious what would happen if we could get a prairie that was less grass dominated. And what happened was other C4 grasses became super dominant. So we have a lot of Cytodes grama and little bluestem and dropseed. So it's hard to avoid this C4 dominance, but sometimes it works out. Things all kind of come together early on, and you can get a prairie like we have on the right. But what do you do with that one on the left? Yeah, so I think I said this before. Restorations are grassier. Oh, and this is I didn't show you this data, but when we looked at those 48 seed mixes that we got relative abundance data for those sites, you look at the grass to forb ratios by weight of the seed in those mixes, and they tend to be between 70 and 80% grass, which is funny because if you look at the literature on recommendations for how to build a seed mix, in all the guides and all the books, everybody says go 50 to 50 in terms of grass to forb seeds, or even go forb heavy. But it's really expensive to build a seed mix with all those rare wildflowers. And so what people tend to do, because it's what they can afford or it's what they're used to, is we make these really grassy seed mixes. Especially older prairie sites have this problem. So what about seed additions? Can we just solve this problem by adding the conservative wildflower species we're looking for? Just toss them in there, and then over time, maybe they'll come in and we can reduce the grasses. There's a ton of studies on seed additions in general in restoration and specifically in grasslands. But some of the main lessons here I can summarize for you is that without a major disturbance, adding seeds to an existing community of perennial grassland plants is not that effective. You have to have some kind of disturbance. And even with that, oftentimes the effect sizes are small, that these species tend to be more establishment limited, not dispersal limited. And even if you get some species that come in, that effect can be transient. It may not last super long. And we do know that it's these C4 grasses that are causing this problem. They create microsite limitation. So I did want to mention that because everyone does a seed addition study, I thought I would do my own. So this is another dissertation chapter that I'm not going to talk about today, but we did a seed addition experiment where we varied the year in which seeds arrived and how much arrived each year. And long story short, the seed additions didn't increase diversity. So like a lot of other studies have found, you can't just throw seed in and hope that that'll work very well. So here's a newer approach that we're suggesting, which is the use of grass selective herbicides. So graminicides, there are 4 of them from what I've found that are used variously. They're herbicides that were developed for agricultural systems for forb crops, and they've been used increasingly in the restoration and conservation world, but not in this kind of way. Usually graminicides are used, they're sprayed on invasive species to kind of suppress invasives, but they haven't really been used in native vegetation as a way of altering functional group ratios, right? As a way of suppressing grasses to favor forbs. That's a novel use of a graminicide. And basically they work because they inhibit ACC-ACEs, and grasses only have one of these pathways, whereas wildflowers have 2, so they can still function. I wanted to highlight one study that has looked at graminicide application. So this is a study from the tallgrass prairie LTER at Kanza in Kansas. And they did something really exciting where they had these plots that were full of switchgrass and big blue stem. And they hand cut each stem of big blue stem and then used a sponge to apply graminicide, like right to the plants. And they either removed 0, 50%, or 100% of these dominant C4 grasses to see what happened. And sure enough, if you get rid of your dominant C4 grasses, you can increase light availability, forb productivity goes up, forb cover goes up, you get all your species richness and evenness. It's exactly what you'd want. But cutting individual grass stems and then applying graminicide with a sponge is not a management strategy that can be applied at large scales. So we were curious whether we could use graminicide at larger scales. So we're designing an experiment using Fusilade, which is one of the ones that has lower environmental concerns. It's not as dangerous for insects. It's been tested on conservative forbs, and it really doesn't kill wildflowers. And it's not too expensive. So a third thing that we could do probably to manage the grassiness in these restored prairies is using this post-addition mowing treatment. I talked earlier about how when starting new prairies, managers are using this first 1 to 2 years suppressing the other vegetation with mowing, but potentially using that kind of treatment after adding seed into existing stands could be useful. We don't really know if this works. It's recommended a lot in terms of interseeding how-to guides, but it hasn't been studied. So our experiment that we started combines all of these 3 methods to sort of figure out the best way to suppress these dominant grasses and try to recruit more wildflowers. So we have a 3-way design where we're either using no herbicide or glyphosate, which is Roundup and should kill everything, or Fusilade, which is just the grass selective herbicide. And then each of those with or without seed additions, and then each of those with or without this post-addition mowing treatment. So it should be an interesting way to see if we can disturb the community in a way that doesn't allow for exotic species to come in or just native weeds to come in, and does facilitate the recruitment of our target seeds from our seed additions. So we marked these plots at Shaw. We did pre-treatment sampling, and we've started to apply the herbicides. We're going to sample next year. We're going to burn these plots this fall and add the seed over this winter. So it'll be exciting to see what we learn from that study. So I just wanted to summarize some general conclusions about what we've learned about prairie restoration. The main conclusion I want you to come away with is that restorations are different than remnants. A lot of work that I wasn't a part of has shown that richness and diversity is different in these two kinds of prairies, but also the structure of plants is different. The phylogeny of the plants that are there is different. The functioning is different. And then now we're looking at how the traits are different. But there's a lot of room for improvement in trying to create restorations that are more matching our targets. And then exotic species are really important. There is still people who are arguing that we shouldn't be xenophobic of exotic species, and that exotics and natives are all the same. But at least in the tallgrass prairie system, the kinds of exotic species that show up, a lot of work has shown they do have different traits and they do function differently. And when we get lots of exotics in these systems, we lose a lot of diversity. So what we found is that if you get a prairie restoration that goes well early, you get a lot of species that recruit well. A lot of times that diversity can be stable. That it's very hard once you have an existing prairie grassland that's low diversity or heavily invaded. These are long-lived perennial species, and it's very hard to manage your way out of a low diversity restoration. So it's good to get it right as soon as you can. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I can take some questions.
Hi, Andrew. Great. Thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk. It was so great to see so much different work. We have a lot of questions for you, so we'll start cruising through them. Lots of people saying hello. Our first question is from Anna Wassel, who asks, do you think the effect of invasives, reduced diversity and richness, was due to constant selection or drift? For example, a decrease in population size leading to random loss with respect to species identity?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. I think it is hard to say with confidence what's happening here. So the way that the lessons gleaned from that study are sort of correlative. We're trying to see in general how things are related. There are much better studies looking at the relationship between native and non-native species in prairies. My graduate advisor, Brian, has a really cool project from Texas, the MEND project, where he actually sowed different prairies with combinations of native and exotic species. You can get at how differences in traits and biology are affecting these things. I think what happens in prairie restorations is that it depends on the exotic species. There's all kinds of mechanisms that can result in a given invasive species becoming invasive, right? There's enemy escape, or there's different ways that they can exploit resources. I think part of the problems with prairie restorations is a lot of them occur in post-ag land, which is really fertile. There's a lot of nitrogen. And like in native prairie grasslands, you know, those species aren't used to operating under situations where there's just tons of nitrogen to play with. And so I think some of the species that do really well are ones that are better at capitalizing on nitrogen availability. That's one potential. Yeah, there's a lot to get at there. I'm not sure there's a general answer to that question, though.
It's really interesting. Thanks, Andrew. So one question that came in on the chat, and that I also was sort of kind of wondering about, is about sort of this mowing treatment that some of the land managers are using, and whether that might be a good surrogate for grazing from large herbivores, or whether that's even sort of its primary function. And I guess I was sort of curious, have people compared kind of the effects of the mowing practices to sort of that of, you know, a sort of a native grazer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's definitely different. So grazing and mowing are not the same. Because grazing involves an animal, right? So in grazed systems, there's not only the biomass removal that comes with, you know, the chewing, but of course there's also all these effects of like pea spots and, you know, like disturbances from, you know, animals, you know, compacting the soil or disturbing the soil. So like a grazing as a management treatment has a lot of other effects other than just cutting off plant species. And of course, different grazers behave really differently. So there's a lot of work on how cattle and bison are different. And, you know, bison selectively eat grasses, which is proposed as one of the major mechanisms that historically helped prairie remnants become so diverse, is that these dominant grasses had that sort of stabilizing mechanism that helped the other forbs do better. So, you know, mowing is not that. I don't think it has as good of a theoretical surrogate. If we think about historic grasslands, it's sort of a management action. Yeah.
So we've actually reached 5 o'clock. So I'm just going to tell the viewers that we're going to keep asking questions, I think, because there are so many. If that's okay with Andrew, just a couple more. And but you're free to go, obviously. So I want somebody just on the edge of that. Natalie Mueller just says you need buffalo. So I think we were all thinking that, right? So Adam Smith has some great questions here. It says, La Nina usually produces wetter conditions for the Midwest, and we can predict somewhat well whether La Nina will form several months before it occurs. Since wetter springs are better for restoration, it also seems we could forecast whether a given year would be good or bad for initiating restoration. So it seems like you could test this with your data to see if La Nina is a good predictor of restored diversity.
That's super interesting. I'd never even thought of it. Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody who's looked at those like regular and predictable changes in precipitation. That's a really cool idea. I like it. I think someone should do that. Yes, good idea.
It sounds like you and Adam should go down the hall, say hi
his
with
office
your
is
masks
right there.
on, and yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Sarah Swiston asks if you have any data on soil invertebrates in some of the sites that you've sampled, and how those, how, if you had that data, how it might affect it, and if you don't, what you think might be the effects.
Yeah, I don't have I don't have invertebrate data. I know they're doing that. Holly Jones's group and Nick Barber in Illinois, I think they have some papers that just came out on invertebrates. A lot of people have looked at, obviously, there are other trophic levels that matter. There are, in addition to grazers, there are birds, and there's some cool papers that have came out talking about insects and their influence on plant community composition, like grasshoppers. Do a lot of any insect that eats seeds is going to have a huge selection on what comes into a restoration, as well as just like foliar damage. And then of course, we do care about like the pollinators, and there's a lot of research on the kind of pollinators you see as a function of the kinds of wildflowers that you recruit and the abundance of those, and whether floral abundance matters more or floral diversity matters more. So that's really cool stuff, really interested in it. I haven't had a chance to do that kind of large scale research yet, but interesting stuff for sure.
Andrew, there are so many good questions, and I just can't choose one among them. So I think what we're going to do is close down the seminar, and I can save these questions, and you can look over them, and potentially you'll recognize some of the faces or names, and you could contact the person if you want to talk about it more. And I'm sure also that anybody can find your information on your website and on Mobot's website if they wanted to ask you questions via email and whatnot. So I think I'm gonna, on that note, say thank you very much for coming. We had a lot of people who really enjoyed your talk here, and hopefully one day soon we'll all be able to meet. Well, I guess you guys have already been meeting in person with masks on outside and stuff, but maybe more of us will be able to do that. So thank you again so much.
Thanks for this opportunity. This is great. Thanks, everyone.